Okay, today we're going to be learning Pesachim, Daf Yud Aleph. Today's Shiur is dedicated by Racheli Mendelssohn in memory of her mother Shoshana Spitz on her third Yurtzeit. Okay, our learning should be Le'iloi Nishmata. We are continuing on in this sugya, and yesterday was all about Sfekot and doubtful situations. Today is all about Gzerot, when we are stringent because we're concerned maybe you will come to do something. And the whole running assumption of the Gemara and its questions anyway, its answers we're going to see is totally different. But all the questions today are really going to be of the type of either you're the type of person that is, okay, let's forbid this just in case you come to do that, or you're the type of person that doesn't. And then we're going to have all sorts of issues because why do you do it here and not there? And why are you concerned here and not there? So let's start with what we saw yesterday. We saw yesterday that the Rav Yosef basically, after questioning the Mishnah and thinking, we thought originally that Rabbi Yehuda needs B'dika 3 times. In the end, we say no. He doesn't say you do B'dika 3 times. He says that you can only do B'dika 3 times at 3 times of day, meaning if you didn't do it at night, which is the ideal time, do it in the morning. If you didn't do it in the morning, do it late in the morning. But once you're finished with late in the morning, you can't go any farther than that. Okay? Whereas the rabbis allowed you to do it even b'toch hamoed, which we said there's different interpretations, whether they mean actually on Pesach or during the time where chametz is forbidden on Erev Pesach. Either which way, the rabbis are allowing it in a time where chametz is forbidden and Rabbi Yehuda is not. And we assumed at the end of yesterday's daf, and this assumption is correct, that, or at least they don't question it, that Rabbi Yehuda is concerned that if we allow you to check for chametz in a time where it's forbidden, you might come to accidentally eat chametz. And we talked about yesterday why there are possible reasons. Chametz, first of all, is very chamor. It's very serious because it's isur karet if you eat it, which is always very serious, where you get cut off before your time or children die before your time. Nobody really knows what it is, but it's a punishment by God of some sort of being cut off early. And also we have the issue of badil mineh, which we're going to talk about today, or lo badil mineh, which is people are not regularly badil mineh. They're not badil mineh. Badil mineh means you usually distance yourself from something. Now, chametz, you eat all year round. Because of that, you're so used to eating it that there's more of a chance you'll come to eat it. Okay, we'll see the rabbi's approach, which is not the same. The rabbis are not concerned for this, and therefore they allow badika. So our question is going to mainly focus on Rabbi Yehuda, although we're going to raise some questions on the rabbi's opinion along the way. So the Gemara starts off 2 lines from the bottom of Yud Amud Bet. Umi gazal Rabbi Yehuda dilma ate lemecha mineh. Is Rabbi Yehuda really concerned that if we allow you to do one thing, you might come to eat it? Because we're going to show you a case where he's not at all concerned for that. Again, this is assuming if you make a gzera that maybe you'll eat chametz, then you should make a gzera somewhere else that you might come to eat something and we shouldn't allow something. So what is this? We're talking about the Omer. What is the Omer? The Omer is the sacrifice they would bring on the second day of Pesach. And until you bring the sacrifice of the Omer, you're not allowed to eat from the new wheat crop. And once you bring the Omer, you're allowed to eat from the new crop. So it says here in the Mishnah, Tnan, Misha Karev HaOmer, as soon as they sacrificed it, Yotzin umotzim shukei Yerushalayim shehem leim kemach v'kali. The second they finish it, you can go out to the shuk and you'll see the shuk is full of people selling flour from the new crop and kali, which is this roasted flour. Now, how did they get the flour if you're not allowed to deal with the Omer? Now, you can't just, have flour in a second. You have to harvest it, right? You have to do all the steps of the process until you get to it being flour. So if that's the case, that means that even though the new crop wasn't permitted, we did allow you to deal with it. Liksor, to cut it, to, process it, to all those processes to get to flour. So according to the first opinion, which is Rabbi Meir, shelo b'ratzon chachamim, okay, either osim or not osim, but whatever it is, shelo b'ratzon chachamim. In other words, the fact that you go out into the shuk and you can find flour in the shuk from the new wheat immediately is a problem. The rabbis did not permit this. Now, why did the rabbis permit this according to Rabbi Meir? They didn't like this because they didn't want people dealing with it until it was allowed. They were worried people might eat it. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, and that's what's important for our purposes. What would we expect Rabbi Yehuda to say? It's forbidden. If we allow you to deal with it, you might come to eat it, just like with b'dikat chametz. But he says here, He says, well, first we should stop for a minute. The source ends with he says, no, the rabbis were totally fine with this. No problem. You can get things ready before Pesach without a problem. We don't have to worry that you're going to come to eat from it. So now they say, here you see, Rabbi Yehuda is not worried. If we allow you to do that, you might come to eat it. So what do we answer? We're going to have 3 answers. Okay, it's going to take a little while till we get to all of them. And the main one is going to be Abaye, which is the middle answer. That's the one that's going to stay. And then we're going to ask some questions on Abaye. Amal Rabba. This should be Rabba. Okay, some of the people change it. The Girsa should be Rabba. You can see in the Masorah Hashas. Makes sense with the way the sugya works. Rabba was a generation before Abaye and Rava. So usually things go chronologically. We start with Rabba, then we go to Abaye, and then we go to Rava, who kind of responds to Abaye. So it makes sense that this is Rabba. So a few times we're going to see, we're going to have to change it. Amar Rabba, Shane Chadash, Mishum Shelo Hitartelo Ela Al Yedei Kituf, Hu Zachol. What does this mean? When they allowed you to harvest, to cut the grain before Pesach, they didn't allow you to do it in a normal way with the usual implement that they use. No, they allowed you only to do it by hand. Now, if you're doing it by hand, that will always remind you that you can't eat it. So there's a constant reminder. Because you have a constant reminder, then we know, you'll remember, this is like Shabbat. Remember, we're worried Shema Yateh, you might tilt the candle. But if there's some sort of, you're doing it with 2 people, so one will remind the other. Remember, if you're reading with 2 people, we're not worried. Or all sorts of things that when we're worried, we're not concerned that you might forget. So here you'll remember because you're doing it different, like with the Shinui. Amalei Abaye. Abaye says, wait, that makes a lot of sense. Tinach b'shat ktifa, when you're taking them out of the ground, yes. But but what about when you're grinding them or sifting them? So they say halokasha, that's not difficult. You use a hand grinder, and harkadal al gav nafa, you turn it upside down. In other words, also there you have to do it with a shinoi, with some sort of change. So basically, Rabba says, because all along the way you're doing it with some sort of shinoi, that reminds you all the time and you won't come to eat it. Whereas bedika chametz, you're going to find your chametz and then you'll see it and you might come to eat it. There's no such thing. So they say, wait a minute. That doesn't make sense, though. It makes a lot of logical sense, but it doesn't stand the test to other sources because it says, it says in the following Mishnah, Kotzlin beit hashlachim v'sheba amakim aval lo godshim v'ukimna ke Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore ma'ika lemeimar. What does this mean? There's a bunch of types of fields, like a field that needs irrigation. Okay, some of the fields didn't need irrigation. This was a field right there. You got water by other natural means. This is a field that needs irrigation, or the ones in the valley, which are considered, the crops don't grow so well, so you can't bring from there for the actual omer. In other words, the omer involved the sacrifice with the new wheat, and then the new grain, and then you would basically be allowed to eat. Since these can't be used for the omer, they allow you to cut them normally. Okay, so now you can cut them normally. You just don't make the usual pile. You do one minor change to it. And yet they said that this source goes like Rabbi Yehuda. Now, if it goes like Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabba's whole theory is that Rabbi Yehuda isn't concerned here because you do it with some sort of change, here we allow you to cut the grain of the new crop before Pesach, even without any shinoi. And why isn't Rabbi Yehuda worried that you're going to maybe eat it? So therefore, we're stuck, and therefore we reject Rabba. So Ela Amar Abaye. Abaye brings a different answer. And this is what I said in the beginning. Chadash badil minei. Chametz lo badil minei. Chadash, because it's not allowed until after you bring the omer, people stay away from it. We're not worried you're going to think accidentally you could come to eat it. Whereas chametz, people are used to eating all the time. It's not like the chametz is a different object, right? It's the same thing before Pesach and after Pesach. The new stuff is new. It's not the old crop. So there's a difference between the new crop and the old crop. And you're not going to confuse those. And you stay away from the new crop until the moment that it's allowed. So that's very clear cut. You're not going to confuse. But chametz, you're so used to eating all year round that we're worried that you're going to eat it. Okay, so now Amar Rava. So Rava points out now, our whole question was on Rabbi Yehuda. The Rabbi Yehuda is gozel in our case. He's worried in chametz, but he's not worried in chadash. And then we resolved it by saying, okay, chametz were more concerned. But Rava comes and says, De Rabbi Yehuda kasha, de Rabbanan lo kasha. I don't understand. You asked, why was your focus only on Rabbi Yehuda? What about Rabbanan? They disagree with Rabbi Yehuda in both cases. The assumption is that Rabbi Meir is Rabbanan, is representative of Rabbanan. So when it comes to the Omer, the rabbis say you can't do it. It was shelo b'ratzon chachamim. And when it comes to chametz, you can do bedika. So it's what? Is that not a contradiction? That's why are we only focusing on Rabbi Yehuda? So he says the following. Do Rabbi Yehuda lo kasha kedishanina. Okay, I get Rabbi Yehuda's not a question, like you said, Abai. But Rabbanan nami lo kasha, and I'm going to give you an answer for what you didn't address, which is the rabbis, the contradiction of the Rabbanan. Who, and here's what you probably would have said, which is, Hu atzmo mechazer alav l'sarfo, mechal ka'achel mineh. You're doing bedika chametz in order to find whatever chametz there is and destroy it. You really think someone's going to come to eat it? No way. Whereas chadash is something you're going to eventually be allowed to eat, so you might come to eat it. But chametz, while you're doing bedika, you think really you're going to come and eat it? No way. So he says that's why the rabbis, in this case, were not concerned, but were concerned when it came to chadash. So we now have explanations for both sides. Rav Ashi brings a third answer, and then, like I said, we're going to go back to Abai and ask a whole bunch of questions on this. Do Rabbi Yehuda lo kasha, kemach v'kalitnan. What are they selling in the shuk? They're selling flour and this roasted flour. Now, is that something you eat? No, nobody eats flour plain. It's something that you bake with, you use for also, but you don't eat it raw. So why are you worried? And when you find chametz in your house, you might come to eat it. But when you go to the shuk, right, let's say when you're dealing with it and you're grinding it up into flour, we're not worried that you're going to end up just eating it. Right now, kali, it's true. I see, Gita, you wrote the Boaz of Ruth kali. There are cases, kali it's a toasted grain and people do kind of eat it. So hard to say exactly, but I guess it wasn't maybe the most appealing kind of food that you would think somebody might come to eat it. Maybe that's his question. But the main point is that these are more raw ingredients and they're not really the finished product. And therefore, why would you even be worried that someone will come to eat it? So now the Gemara says very strongly, Hadrav Ashi bedutahi. This is a joke, or this is wrong. Okay, there's different ways of understanding beduta. When I just taught the Hebrew Zoom, someone asked, the Hebrew's now on Zoom, and I teach it before. If anyone's interested, by the way, that there's Zoom in Hebrew at 6:20 every morning. Someone asked, how could they be so disrespectful to Rav Ashi, right? Rav Ashi, especially Rav Ashi, right? How could you be so disrespectful to Rav Ashi and say it's bedutahi? So my suggestion was that, first of all, we see all along the Gemara that sometimes the rabbis are incredibly respectful when they disagree, and sometimes they're kind of disrespectful. Now, here it's the Gemara commenting. It's not even Rav Ashi. First of all, it's interesting. Rav Ashi put together the Gemara, right? So I assume he didn't write this about himself. It's kind of interesting. It could be this is added later. But sometimes I think that it's the approach of they're so passionate about what they're saying that they say, how could you possibly say this? It's so unfathomable that he would say such a thing. So in any case, it's a good question when this term is used and when not. But anyway, the Gemara says this is a mistake. Why? Hatinach mikali ve'elach, but mikara ad kali ma'ika lememar. Well, it's true that you can't eat it, and once it gets to this stage, it's not really edible. But you can, and this is, it might be that what we're talking here is about the toasted flour. I'm guessing that the kali is toasted flour, which comes up a number of times. If you toast the grain itself, you can eat that. But if you toast the flour, it was actually used as a sweet flour. So I'm guessing that that's what they mean. They're talking about flour and sweet flour. And both of those are raw ingredients. But before the earlier stages, when you toast the grain, then it's edible. So if that's the case, then what we're going to say is, right, I get what you're saying, Rav Ashi, that at this stage we're not worried you might eat, but you might eat it earlier. So what you're saying is basically they're saying ridiculous, right? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't hold up to the test because we should be worried before Pesach when you're preparing this that you might come to eat some of the grains, either before they're toasted or maybe when they're still soft, you could also eat them before you even toast them. So basically it doesn't really stand up, your theory. And if you want to say, again, I'm fixing this word, it should be rabba. If you want to say by picking it by hand, then maybe that's why you'll remember, But Ella, we're still back to our question on Rabbah, which is, what about the source, the Mishnah that says, Kotzlim beit hashlachim v'sheba amakim v'ukim naki Rabbi Yehuda ma'ika lamemar. But it still doesn't help because there are certain grains in the fields that you have to irrigate and in the valleys that you actually can cut normally, and yet we're not worried. So basically, your answer doesn't hold any water. And therefore, they say, Ela de Rav Ashi bedutehi, must be a mistake. Now, by the way, by saying Rav Ashi is a mistake doesn't necessarily mean, like if we go back to the question I was asked at the end of the previous shiur, which is, what do you mean? How could he possibly say this? So it's very likely that the Gemara is saying maybe it's a mistake whoever brought this in the name of Rav Ashi. Maybe they misunderstood what Rav Ashi said, and that maybe that's a mistake. In other words, it doesn't necessarily mean Rav Ashi is mistaken. It's what they say Rav Ashi said could possibly be a mistake. So now the Gemara says, let's go back to Abaye. Abaye's whole theory is, if you separate yourself from this item generally and it stands on its own and you're not generally, you know that you have to keep distance, then we're not worried. But when you don't really keep any distance, then we're worried. So now we're going to question that theory. Okay, and that's why he's worried in chametz. Any case where you're not going to know to stay away from something, where you regularly use it, Rabbi Yehuda is going to make a gzera. We're going to show you a case where he doesn't. The Hadran, doesn't it say in the Mishnah? This is the Mishnah in Perek Bameh Madlik, in the second Perek of Shabbat, which apropos is the Perek that talks about Hanukkah. It's the only place in the Gemara where Hanukkah is mentioned. Not the only place, but it's mentioned a little bit in Nezikim, which is actually quoted there in Bameh Madlikin, but mainly the ideas of Hanukkah all come up there when it's talking about candle lighting and what oils you can use for candle lighting on Shabbat. It says there, Lo yikov adam shvoferet shel beitza v'yimalena shemen v'yitnena b'tzad hanel b'shvil shetei menatefet. You can't create, okay, v'afilu hi shel cheres. You can't create, take an eggshell, poke a little hole in it, and have the oil drip down slowly into the candle. The candle really means the utensil that held the oil and the wick, and have the oil drip down slowly. Why? Because what are we worried about? We're worried that you might come to take and use the oil. They say even if it's cheres. Cheres is usually considered disgusting once it has oil. If you remember, we talked about that in Masechet Shabbat in this parak of Bameh Madlikin. Even if it's cheres, we're still worried that you might come to use the oil. Now, what would you call oil? Oil is lo badil mineh. You don't normally separate yourself from oil. You very often use oil all the time. So come the rabbis and they say, oil, we're worried. Now, what happens? If I take oil from this eggshell that has a little hole in it and it's dripping down into my candle holder, what will happen? I'm basically going to cause the fire to go out earlier. That's a malacha of kiboy. I'm causing it to extinguish earlier. So come the rabbis and they say, because we're worried that you might take oil from here, we don't allow this. Comes Rabbi Yehuda Matil. He's not worried. What do you mean he's not worried? Isn't shemen, oil, something we use all the time? And therefore, shouldn't we be concerned that you're going to come and use the oil? So how do we explain this? Because Shabbat is so serious. Now, this is a difficult answer, and I'll tell you why in a minute if you haven't figured it out yourself, which is Shabbat is so serious that people are certainly not going to take from the oil here. We're not worried about that. Wouldn't you say the same for Pesach? What do you mean? Chametz on Pesach isn't so serious, right? How don't we take Chametz on Pesach so seriously? So it's a bit of a question. Why, again, he's worried about Chametz on Pesach and not here, okay? So, but the Gemara seems to say, because of the Chumrah of Shabbat, everybody knows that you can't do that, and therefore we're not worried about it. Could be that there's also a distinction between something you might eat and just using oil. There we're not assuming you're not going to eat the oil. You want to use it for anointing something, for I don't know what, but putting it on your body maybe, but I'm not sure. But maybe the taiva for it, the desire for that is going to be less than the desire to eat, right? We all know that, there's food in front of you. Sometimes you eat it, right? I don't know if you have this issue, but some people on fast days have dreams that they ate on a fast day, because you're so used to eating that you accidentally eat something. So it's very likely that's the issue. Whereas, right, I see Art, you're writing, which is good, that maybe on Shabbat, it comes every week and Pesach comes only once a year. So maybe people are more used to Shabbat. Again, that's not what it's very good theory, as is possibly what I suggested, but the Gemara doesn't say so, which is interesting. You would have thought the Gemara, they're asking so many questions, they would have asked this, but they don't. They basically say, we distinguish between Shabbat. So now the Gemara says, okay, well, let me go with you on that. And I'm going to ask another question. You think on Shabbat, Rabbi Yehuda's never goes there? Again, we're basically, this idea of making a gzerah and worrying if we allow this, we'll come to do something else. Every time the Gemara questions it, they seem to think that this is a blanket thing, right? So, okay, it's always when you're, if you're not badil mineh, if you're not used to keeping yourself separate, we should be worried. Oh, no, there's a distinction here with Shabbat. Now, Ramish Shabbat to Shabbat, but there's another case in Shabbat where he is worried. And as if you're going to say Shabbat, he's never worried because people know all the laws of Shabbat and they're very careful about it. Well, here we're going to see another issue. Ditanya, we learned this in Eruvin actually, and in Shabbat. Chevel, I don't know if we learned this, I can't remember if this source appears exactly in Eruvin, but we definitely discuss similar things. I think we learned it exactly. Chevel delisha nifsak, lo yehe koshro ela onvo. If you have a pail, and the rope that you let the pail down into the well rips, tears, you can't knot it, but you can tie it in a bow. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, koreh halav punda o piskia. You can use a belt or a sash to kind of keep it together. Ubevad shelo yanvenu, but you are not allowed to tie a bow. Now the assumption is, why does he think you can't tie a bow? If you remember from Eruvin, that's not the reason. But right now they think the reason is because maybe you'll come to tie a knot. A bow is not forbidden on Shabbat, but a knot is forbidden. So here you see, Rabbi Yehuda says, don't tie a bow because you might come to tie a knot. Well, then why does he let you do this shvoferet shel beitza? And he's not worried that you're going to take some oil out from there. So kasha de Rabbi Yehuda, and not only that, but every time Rabbi Yehuda contradicts himself, we have a problem with the reverse, which is kasha de Rabbanan de Rabbanan. Right? The rabbis don't allow the shoferet shel beitza, and they do allow the aniva, the tying a bow. So we're going to have to explain both. We're going to start with the Rabbanan and the Rabbanan lo kasha. Shemen b'shemen michlaf, aniva b'kshira lo michlaf. If there's shemen, we're worried that you might come to use the oil, but we're not worried that you're going to tie a bow, and from there you'll think that you can tie a knot. Everybody knows a bow is a bow and a knot is a knot. That's not something we're concerned about. Again, the questions all assume general categorizations. I'm the kind of person who's gozer or I'm not gozer. But the answers are always, it all depends on the situation, right? It depends. Are we worried here or are we not worried here? So he says, people don't confuse. And again, this is all, and this whole daf, both this and the next mission is all about kind of human behavior, right? What do we think, or human error, right? What do we think people will confuse? What do you think they're going to assume? So now they say so now Rabbi Yehuda lo kashya. Okay, we're in the third wide line. Why is that not a contradiction? Why he doesn't allow aniva and he does allow the egg shell? Tama de Rabbi Yehuda lav mishum de gazar aniva atuk shira. You thought it was because he's making a gzera and he's worried if we allow tying a bow, you'll think you could tie a knot? No. Ela mishum de kasavar anifa gufa kshirahi. He thinks that tying is a form of a knot. He thinks that in itself is forbidden. If you remember, we learned this near the end of Masechet Eruvin, that tying a bow is a knot. So therefore, it's not a gzera. And therefore, this has nothing to do with our topic at all. The Rami Rabbanan ad Rabbanan. Now, by the way, since we're getting a little bit off, okay, and I tried to organize this on the sheet for you, everything, so that you can see the structure. But now we're going off on a bit of a tangent. The rabbis seem to contradict themselves somewhere else about this issue of the aniva. Here we said, if it rips, so if it tears, what do? You don't tie it in a knot, you could tie it in a bow. But now it says, Ditznan, another Mishnah says, Koshrim deli b'psikya, you can use a sash, aval lo b'chevel, but you can't use a rope. The Rabbi Yehuda matir chevel. Rabbi Yehuda allows a rope. So now the Gemara is going to ask, Demai. Rabbi Yehuda matir, period. Chevel demai, what kind of rope are we talking about? Ilema chevel de alma. If you're going to say that the rabbis say you can't do it with a rope, but notice Rabbi Yehuda allows it with a rope. Now, how could you possibly tie it with a rope? Right? It says koshrim, in a knot. How could you tie it? Now, what kind of knot is allowed on Shabbat? What we call a kesher she'eino shel kayama, something that's very temporary. So, chevel de alma, ilema chevel de alma, Rabbi Yehuda matil. It can't possibly be a regular rope. Can't be that Rabbi Yehuda allows you to tie a regular rope. What's the issue? A regular rope you're going to leave there forever. That's a kesher shel kayama. It's going to last. Kesher shel kayamahu. Divadai ati libatule. For sure you're going to leave it there and not come back to it. Elapshita digarde. It must be you're talking about the weaver's rope. Now, a weaver's rope, what will happen if the weaver uses his rope to tie, or we use rope of a weaver to tie our pail? After Shabbat, we're going to untie it and then do it the way we really want it to be, because the weaver's not going to want to give up on their rope. Why don't the rabbis allow it, even though it's not it's only a temporary knot? They say because we're worried if we allow a chevel of the rope of the weavers, then you'll think that regular rope is allowed, and that's not. So what do you see here? The rabbis make a gzerah here. They're worried, right? So what do we say? And they're not worried if we allow you to tie a bow that you might come to tie a knot. So again, the Gemara is going to ask, chevel b'chevel michlaf. They're going to answer, chevel b'chevel michlaf, aniva b'kshira lo michlaf. Again, rope and rope you might confuse, but bow and knot you're not going to confuse. That's very obvious. Okay, now we're back to Abai. So Abai's whole theory is chametz people don't keep away from. However, they do keep away from chadash, and therefore we're not worried. So now we're going to question that assumption, the second part. And it's first we questioned the first part and said, what about Shabbat? Aren't you worried about Shabbat with the Shemim? And then we said, no, Shabbat's different. And then we questioned, is Shabbat really different? Look at this. And then we answered it. No, that's not a gzerah. That's because kshira, aniva is kshira. Now we're going to say, what do you mean? Vahatanya, I'm going to show you a case where badal people keep their distance from it, and yet he did institute a gzerah. What is this? So some background. The firstborn animal is supposed to go to the Kohen. The Kohen is supposed to bring this as a sacrifice, and then he eats the meat. If the animal were to die, then he wouldn't be able to eat the meat. It would be a huge financial loss. So if you have a bechor sha'chazo dam that started bleeding heavily, and you're worried it's going to die, afilu hu meit. Afilu hu meit doesn't mean he's dead. It means even if he looks like he's about to die. Okay, now what was the best thing that they would do? There's a lot of blood pressure, so you do bloodletting, and that would let out some of the pressure, and the hope would be that the animal would survive. So that's what you want to do, basically, right? Bloodletting was something that was done until like the 19th century or something by people thought it was healthy. Nowadays, people don't, but they thought it then. We don't allow you to bloodlet. What's the concern? We're going to see in a minute. Another thing you're not allowed to do, if the bechor, the firstborn, gets a mum, a blemish that won't allow you to bring it to the temple, right? You can't sacrifice it. Then the Kohen's allowed to eat it in his house, and he could just slaughter it and eat it whenever he wants. He doesn't have to go to the Beit HaMikdash. It's obviously in the Kohen's best interest to have it blemished, because then he wouldn't have to waste, first of all, his time going to the temple, and also some of the parts have to get burnt on the altar, so he doesn't get to eat everything in the animal. So therefore, it's forbidden also by the Torah for the Kohen to inflict a wound on the animal in a way that's going to cause him to be blemished. Now, bloodletting doesn't necessarily cause it to be a mum, because usually it'll just heal. But if you do it in a particular location, it could cause the animal to become blemished. So what does Rabbi Yehuda say? We don't allow you to do akazat dam. Why? We're worried that if we allow you to bloodlet, you might blemish the animal on purpose. We'll see why in a minute. The rabbi's saying, no problem, you can do this. Just make sure not to put a mum in the animal. Make sure not to blemish the animal when you do it. So what do you see here? You see that Rabbi Yehuda, here's a case now. Bechor, people keep their distance from. They know it's sanctified. They know you can't blemish the animal. So theoretically, Rabbi Yehuda shouldn't have to institute any sort of gzerah here. And yet he forbids you to do it, lest you might come to actually blemish the animal on purpose. So what did they answer? Oh no, this is a unique case. When you're worried about something happening to your money, and this comes up a number of times in the Gemara, we're worried that you're anxious about losing your money. If that's the case, what's going to happen? If we allow you to bloodlet, you might just quickly bloodlet anywhere, and you might actually come to blemish the animal. So therefore, Amrina, we say, if we allow it in a place where it doesn't create a blemish, you might accidentally come to do it in a place where you're going to blemish the animal. So what do the rabbis say here? So again, this is a unique case, and it doesn't fit into our general box of if you keep your distance, if you keep your distance, right, then he's not worried. Here he is worried. This is for a separate reason, because he thinks that you're going to be very anxious. We all know that when you're anxious, you come to do things that you later regret, right? You don't do things carefully. Right? If something's broken in your house and you start getting frustrated, you try to fix it, and sometimes you break it more because you're just so worked up about getting it fixed that you break it more. So now, what's Rabbanan's approach? Now, we finished answering our question, but now we want to understand the rabbis. Kol shekain. Now, first of all, the rabbis don't disagree that you're bahula mamono, but they take it in a different direction. This is all fascinating sugyas. Why? Because we're trying to figure out what is in the head of a person and what will that cause them to do. So Rabbi Yehuda says you're in your head is, I got to fix this animal. I'm going to do anything I can, and I might, end up putting a blemish in. Rabbanan say, Kol shekain, di'ilo sharet leklal, ate leme'abad. If you don't allow it in a way that it's allowed, they're going to come to actually blemish the animal. In other words, let them bloodlet in a place. And what do the rabbis say? As long as you don't put a mum in the animal, we'll let you do it. But if we don't let you do anything at all, then they'll say, oh, well, then may as well blemish the animal, right? In other words, they'll say, if you don't allow them, this is basically saying, if you don't allow people to do something that's really important for them to do, they're going to do it anyway. And once they're doing something wrong, maybe they'll go even farther and say, oh, let me blemish the animal too while I'm at it. And then I won't have to bring it to the temple. So therefore, he says, the whole concern of bahula mamono means people aren't going to keep this law if you make it too strict. So basically, the rabbis say, let's let them do it in a way that it's allowed. And then at least they'll do it in a way that's allowed and not in a way that's not allowed. So it's interesting theories as to, what we expect people to do and how we treat that in halacha. Now we're going to go question. Okay, this is a very bit of a dizzying daf, right? We keep assuming things and then we start questioning them. So we have our basic assumptions, right? If you're badil minei or lo badil minei, right? Whether we gozer or not. But then within that, we keep bringing these exceptions to the rule and then saying, well, do those exceptions really stand? Is it really true Shabbat? He's never gozer. What about the anifa? Now we're saying, is it really true that if Adam bahula mamono, then we're worried? Rabbi Yehuda Adam bahula mamono, v'hatnan. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, in a similar case, if your animal has, I assume this is if your animal has like bugs on it or lice or something like that, and you want to comb your animal. Okay, so how can you comb your animal on Shabbat? Ein mikardim. It should be mikardim, not mikadrin. Mikadrim we had in Eruvin. That was when the people went at different heights on the mountain. Ein mikardin habehema b'yom tov. You can't comb the animal on Yom Tov. Mipnei shu oseh chabura, because it makes a wound in the animal. Aval mikartzifin. But you can comb it with, we're going to see, you can't comb it with a fine tooth comb, but you can comb it with a thicker, if there's thicker teeth on the comb. The chachamim omrim mikardin af ein mikardin af ein mikartzifin. The rabbis don't allow either. Now, Vitanya, ezu kirud ve'ezu kirtzuf. What's the difference? Kirud ktanim v'osin chabura. Those are small and they make a wound. Kirtzuf gedolim ve'enosim chabura. So what do you see? The bigger ones don't make a chabura, and yet Rabbi Yehuda doesn't say, now here, you're bahula mamono, because it's your animal, just like we talked about before, and it's your, this belongs to you, you're worried about it. So therefore, we don't allow you to, we allow you to use the thick one, because we're not worried if we allow you the thick one, you'll end up using the fine tooth comb. So why is he not worried? Hatam di shavik le mayit. So now the answer. Hatam ishav, these two situations are incomparable. Adam bahula mamono is when you're worried the animal's going to die. Hatam di shavik le mayit amrinan adam bahula mamono. The whole question here is, why do we allow you to do it with one comb? If you say people are bahula mamono, you might come to use the fine tooth comb also if you're so anxious to deal with your animal and make him comfortable. But they say, no, that's not bahula mamono. To make your animal comfortable is something totally different than worrying your animal's going to die and you're going to have a financial loss. So when you're worried he's going to die, we say adam bahula mamono. Hachi shavik le tzara ba'almahu. Here it just is uncomfortable for the animal. And therefore, lo amrinan adam bahula mamono, we're not worried that you're going to come to use the wrong comb when you're doing this. Now, the Gemara ends with one last question before we move on to the next Mishnah. If we take now this last case that we just had and we compare it to the first case, kirtzuf, he's not worried about. If you use the thicker comb, you might come to use the thinner comb. But chametz, he is worried about. What's the difference? Lechem belechem michlaf, kirud bekirtzuf lo michlaf. Because bread, you might confuse. Now, you're used to eating bread, and therefore you might eat bread on Erev Pesach, or maybe even Pesach. But when it comes to kirud and kirtzuf, thick comb, thin comb, that's not something we're really worried about. So again, even though all along we keep saying, generally, do you do this? Do you do that? In this case, in that case, and in the end, he says it's all very particular. The Gemara keeps answering, we don't have general rules, okay? With I see, Shoshana, you're getting into general rules about Rav Yehuda, that he wasn't concerned about intention and things like this. So I'm just reading quickly your note that you see as a natural tendency to be worried and be overly concerned. So right. So on the one hand, you see he is concerned, but the Gemara in the end is really saying that he looks at every situation independently and says, is this a case where we have reason to be concerned or is it not? So it kind of, this sugya seems to say there's no general rules about this really. I mean, maybe there are some general, but each case is really looked at in particular. What's the reason? Is there a concern? Is there not a concern? If there's a concern, right, we look at human behavior, and then obviously we all know that if you're going to analyze human behavior, you get to many different understandings, because some people look at human behavior, people will likely do this, and other people say, oh no, I think people will likely do that. Like the bahula mamono, what will it cause you to do, right? We had the two different approaches. It's very interesting in terms of that. And we're going to see even more now when we go to the next Mishnah. This is also a fascinating sugya, which we're only going to get started on today, and we'll continue more tomorrow. So I'll leave the depth of the upcoming sugya for tomorrow. And the parak of Gefet is about this. We'll see in a minute. I'll tell you what it's about. Rabbi Meir Omer, ochlim kol chamesh v'sorfim b'tchilat shesh. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ochlim kol arba v'tolim kol chamesh v'sorfim b'tchilat shesh. Here we have a machloket. We'll see it's a three-way machloket. Right now we see two opinions, which is even though chametz is forbidden from 6 hours into the day, which is basically midday, chatzot, noon, but everyone basically made it a little bit earlier so the people don't get confused. And Shuli Mishkin wrote this week in Flashback on our site all about, right, she deals with history relating to the daf, sundials and how they kept time and all sorts of really interesting things. So recommended reading. You can imagine in a time when you didn't have clocks. First of all, nowadays, there's people who put their clock 5 minutes later so that they come on time to things, right? They think it's late, and it's kind of the same idea. It's just like we ended Masechet Eruvin with the 15 amot outside the city, that basically they knew that people were going to make mistakes, and because of that, they basically said, this is an issue. By the way, I'm speaking next week in the National Library in their lecture series, and I'm speaking about this topic from the daf because it's so interesting in terms of how human error affects halacha, and particularly we're going to get to dinei nefashot, killing people in court, and we're going to see how significant this is. So Rabbi Meir says you eat the whole 5th hour, okay, which means until 11, okay? Yeshuli's article is on the Hadran site, okay, and it'll probably be sent around, but it's on the Hadran site. Rabbi Meir Omer, ochlim kol chamesh v'sorfim b'tchilat shesh. So you have until 11, basically in the morning, the 5th till the end of the 5th hour, and then in the beginning of the 6th hour, like 11 in a minute, so you burn it. Okay, I'm talking about sha'ot zmaniyot. By the way, Shuli also says in her article that the Romans, this whole sha'ot zmaniyot and the rabbis, which is that they split the day into 12 equal parts. It's not 60-minute hours like we do. So it's very interesting because the Romans did it also, that they split the day into 12 equal parts. That's where we get it from. Okay, so it's not 60-minute hours. In the summer, it's longer hours. In the winter, it's shorter hours. So we just mean midway between sunrise and sunset. So Rabbi Meir says we have to burn at the beginning of the 6th hour, and we can eat until that point. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you can eat until the 4th hour. This is what we do, right? You always have those charts, before Pesach, till what time can you eat, till what time can you burn. This is based on Rabbi Yehuda. You eat the whole first 4 hours of the day. The whole 5th hour is hanging, like you can't eat, but you don't have to burn yet. And sorfim b'tchilat shesh. Okay, you burn at the beginning of the 6th. V'odamar Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda now describes something they did in the temple, very interesting. They took 2 chalot of the korban toda. The korban toda had 40 loaves. 10 of them were chametz, the rest were matzah. Normally, you don't bring chametz into the mikdash. It's one of the few cases that you do. You would take 2 chalot of todah. Most people say they're talking about the bread ones, the chametz ones, although some people say no, they weren't bringing chametz there Erev Pesach, but some people say no, the whole idea was chametz because they wanted to show people chametz. So you took 2 that were psulot, and they have to be disqualified ones. So they found 2 that were disqualified. Munachot al gabei ha'itziba. They would put it on a little like a stool kind of thing that there was, or some sort of stand. in the Har HaBayit, Kozman shemunachot kol ha'am ochlim. So they would put these two chalot. If you saw them there, it's kind of like the torches with the Rosh Chodesh. If you saw them there, right, the Har HaBayit was high up so people could see from a distance, you'd know that you could still eat. Nitla achat, they would take one down. Tolim velo ochlim velo sorfim. That would be the middle part. This is according to Rabbi Yehuda. Nitlo shnehen, once you took them both down, hitchilu kol ha'am sorfim. Then everyone knew it was time for burning. Rabbi Gamliel omer, chulin nechalim kol arba u'truma kol chamesh v'sorfim tchilat shesh. He agrees with Rabbi Yehuda, but with one distinction. He says, other than truma, if you have truma that's chametz and you didn't eat it yet, we allow you 1 extra hour. Why is that? Because otherwise we would make you burn it and go to waste, and we don't like to waste truma because truma is sanctified. Only if you have to burn it do you burn it. Therefore, you get an extra hour for the truma. You can eat that until the 5th hour. Tnan hatam. Now the Gemara gets off into a fascinating discussion, and they bring a Mishnah in Masechet Sanhedrin. Echad omer b'shnayim b'chodesh, ve'echad omer b'shlosha. Edutan kayemet. When you bring witnesses into court, and what they're talking here is about, they're saying somebody killed someone on this day at this hour. And if one says it was on the 2nd of the month, and one says it was on the 3rd of the month, right? They question the witnesses and they want to make sure their testimony, right? They bring one into a room and they bring the other one separately and they ask them all their questions and they see, is there contradictory testimony here? If one says it happened on Bet of Kislev and the other one says it happened on Gimel of Kislev. So what do we say? This is not contradictory testimony. Now you would think it is, but they say, this one maybe thought that Rosh Chodesh was on one day, and the other one thought Rosh Chodesh was a different day, and therefore they really mean the same day. Okay. Now this and all the cases you're going to see are fascinating because we're going to assume that people make certain mistakes. In which case we're going to accept the testimony. In which case we're going to kill someone who we think murdered someone, even though possibly the witnesses are contradicting each other. And this is a fascinating concept. You would think we're so careful not to kill anyone in court if we don't have to. And yet they're basically saying, since we can assume there was human error here, we're actually going to allow this. So let's go on with the cases. If they disagree about a distance of 2 days, though, then edutam b'tela, then clearly we're not going to accept their testimony. Because even if you mess up on what day the Chodesh was, you're not going to mess up a 2-day difference. Now we get to the clock, which is why, right? Sundials, right? Imagine they don't have exact clocks; they can't tell exact time. So, right now it seems like they disagree about an hour. So we assume they just got confused how many hours into the day it was. Rabbi Meir says if it's a 2-hour difference, people don't confuse 2-hour difference. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, edutan kayemet. No, if it's a 2-hour difference, still fine. Okay? Echad Omer b'chamesh, v'echad Omer b'sheva. But if their 2-hour difference is between 3 and 5, we think they might get confused. But between 5 and 7, no way. Why is that? What happens? Midday, the sun is in the middle of the sky. So if it's 5 and 7, edutam b'tela. Why? Their testimony is contradicted. Shebechamesh chama b'mizrach ubesheva chama b'ma'arav. The sun is on a different side of the sky at that point. So people know to distinguish between 5 and 7. Amar Abai. So now Abai comes and analyzes, and we're going to have 2 versions of Abai. We'll only see one of them today. We'll stop after that, and then tomorrow we'll see the other version of Abai and Rav. Keshetim Salomar. If you really look into it, you can see. L'divrei Rabbi Meir. Ein adam to'ev lo klum. Now we thought that according to Rabbi Meir, 2 and 3 people would confuse and they'll make mistakes. He says, no. Rabbi Meir doesn't think that people make mistakes at all. This isn't based on human error. He says, L'divrei Rabbi Yehuda adam to'eh chatzisha. To Rabbi Yehuda, who says they could confuse 3 and 5, he thinks that people can err plus minus half an hour. Sounds weird. It's 2-hour difference. How do we get this? And how can you say Rabbi Meir doesn't think people make mistakes at all? So here he explains. L'divrei Rabbi Meir ein adam to'ev lo klum. Masechet hava, when we talked about 2 and 3, when did the person actually murder? It was the end of the 2nd hour going into the 3rd hour. It's an issue of semantics. One called it 2 because he meant the end of the 2nd hour. One called it 3 because he meant the beginning of the 3rd hour. Really, it was right when it turned from 2 hours a day into 3 hours. And they really mean one and the same thing. It's not a mistake. It's just what they said and what they meant by what they said. Again, you can assume. We don't really know what they said, but we're making assumptions. L'divrei Rabbi Yehuda, adam to'eh chatzisha. So how does this work? Maseki hava bepalga de arba hava. It was 4.5 hours into the day. Now remember, one said 3 and one said 5. So how did they each make a mistake by half an hour? Hai de kamar shalosh meant besof shalosh, at the end of the third, beginning of the fourth. So he messed up by half an hour because it was 4.5. And de palgashata lekame, right? He messed up a half an hour. He was too early. Hai de kamar chamesh betchilat chamesh. He meant the beginning of the fifth. V'katai palga deshata la'achore, and he basically said it was a half hour later than it actually was. So each one could make a mistake of half an hour, and they could come out with saying 3 and 5. Okay, which really means 4, right? One could mean 4 and beginning of 5, or right, there's a way, and then basically it's all half an hour difference. We're going to see, like I said, tomorrow, a different understanding of Abai, and then Rava's explanation, and we're going to discuss this a lot more tomorrow. Okay, have a great day, everybody.